Good evening, everybody. Glad you made it tonight. My name's Hugh Foley. I'm a professor of fine arts at Rogers State University in Claremore. I've taught Native American history there for a little more than 20 years. I'm also an OSU grad. Okay. I'm also a Stillwater resident. I'm extremely honored to be asked. Yeah, Stillwater. All right, glad y'all made it in. I'm extremely honored to be asked to moderate this event tonight, and I'd like to introduce our guests. So please hold your applause till everybody's been introduced. Margie Burkhart is the granddaughter of Molly and Ernest Burkhart. She's here with her husband, Andrew Lowe, and her children, Lauren and Tracy, and their spouses, Jacob and Simone. Marvin Stepson Jr. is the grandson of the late William Stepson, who was profiled in David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon. And Catherine Redcorn served as director of the Osage Tribal Museum for 17 years, where she accomplished many important historic projects, and she's currently an elected member of the Osage Minerals Council. So our stage party tonight. We also have some VIPs in the crowd tonight. You may be able to see them with our lights up here. It's just a big blank view out there. Osage Principal Chief Jeffrey Standing Bear is here with us tonight. And I don't know where Principal Chief is, but he's somewhere here tonight. Also, a descendant of people profiled in the book, Mary Jo Webb is here as well. And I see there's a lot of people here in the audience tonight, and I know there's a bunch of Osages here. So for those of you in the audience who are Osage, would you stand for us and let other people in the audience just see how many of you are here tonight?
Can't see. But
All right. A lot of them here tonight, so we're glad you're here. David Grann is the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Spent 40 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, was named Amazon.com's Best Book of 2017, and was a National Book Award finalist. This past Saturday, the book was named the nonfiction winner of the 2018 Oklahoma Book Award. He's known for his relentless research, powerful investigative style. Grann's pieces have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Washington Post, Boston Globe, The Wall Street Journal. He's a former executive editor of The Hill, senior editor of The New Republic, and is currently a staff writer for The New Yorker, where he's been since 2003. Grann, who Newsweek called the master of nonfiction, has become Hollywood's go-to for memorable nonfiction film material, with a recent movie based on his 2009 book, The Lost City of Z, a tale of deadly obsession in the Amazon. 3 stories in development from 2011's true crime book, The Devil and Sherlock Holmes, Tales of Murder, Madness, and Obsession. And he's also been involved in the huge bidding war, which has finally been settled, I guess, for the film that will come from this book, Killers of the Flower Moon. So we're going to get started with our questions, and we want to encourage our Osage guests to jump in at any time. I'll start out asking David a few questions to give us all some groundwork for the rest of the conversation, and then invite them to say whatever they want to say as the interview goes on. So with that, David, let's find out how much you knew about American Indian history, Oklahoma history, or even the Osage before you started this process.
Shockingly little, embarrassingly little. I grew up in New York or outside New York. My textbooks had the kind of pro forma history that one read, which would usually kind of relegate what happened with Native Americans during the early contact to a few paragraphs and then move on. And Oklahoma as well. And it really wasn't until I found out about this story and I made this trip out to Osage County, and I met Catherine Redcorn and kind of began this journey that lasted many years.
All right. In interviews that many of us have seen in preparation for hearing you talk tonight, you often talk about a historian first told you about the Osage murders. So would you tell us about that initial encounter and what was said that made you to take on this story?
Yeah, there was stories often develop without much planning or purpose when you don't know about them, and I'm always looking for different stories, parts of our history to tell. And I was speaking to a person who knew a lot about FBI history, And most of the conversation was actually about COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's illegal surveillance of leftist groups, including Native American activists during the 70s. And at the very end, or at one point, he mentioned just almost in passingly about the Osage murders. And that kind of just planted something, and that's where I began to look into it, and that's what prompted me to make that trip out to Osage County.
Mm-hmm. When did you realize this was a story you had to write?
Well, I tell the story a lot, and I know some people here have heard it too often, but it's very rare that a story has its origin, an origin story like this, but or is almost a metaphor for the project itself, which is when I came out to Osage County, I really, at that point, had no intention of necessarily even writing about this. I really came out to possibly learn more. And I made this trip to the Osage Nation Museum where Catherine and I was meeting for the first time. I think Charles, your brother, had introduced us. And I met Catherine, and I saw that great photograph, which is still on the wall there, and you can see it on the title page of the book. That was taken in 1924, and that showed members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers. And it went all across the wall. It looked very innocent, but a portion of the photograph was missing. And I asked Catherine what had happened to that portion. And she kind of looked at me a little funny, who is this person? But she said, that portion had contained a figure who was incredibly frightening, and so I removed it. And she then pointed to that missing panel, and she said the devil was standing right there. And she went down into the basement, and they had this image of the missing panel. And there, peering out very creepily, was William Hale, one of the killers of the Osage and of Margie's ancestors. And for me, that was really a kind of a galvanizing moment, because it goes back to your first question, which was, Catherine, obviously, the Osage knew about this history. That's why they had removed the photograph, because it was so painful. And yet, people like me knew nothing. And it was just this missing gap that we had excised and had not learned. And so a lot of the project began almost a journey to address my own ignorance.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear from descendants. What were your initial reactions when you found out this book was going to be written? What did you hope was going to come out of this work? Why did you agree to talk to Mr. Grann? Catherine?
Well, I thought that it was a story that needed to be told. I had heard all of my life, both of my parents being Osage, and I knew about it. And when David first contacted me and we started talking about it, and I didn't have any problems with sharing the information I had with him. And anyway, I was glad it happened.
Glad it happened.
Mm-hmm. And I should just say I could not have told this story without the people on the stage, with many of the Osage, the Vaughns, people in this audience.
Mm-hmm.
I was skeptical when David called and he left a message, and I was like, And so I believe he called again, and I still didn't call him back. And I think he called again, and he said, Catherine. And I thought, okay, he's okay to talk to. He's an okay guy. And then I thought, well, this really is something that needed to be told. Mm-hmm. And I think, after all that, I wish my dad was alive, so he could have experienced it and seen maybe a different side of what was presented. Mm-hmm. Because he grew up as a small child, and he didn't have it easy because of what happened. His dad tried to murder him, murdered his relatives, but then David presented Molly as this loving human being, a person, and I think he just kind of brought it all together, and I think my dad really would have been proud.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. Marvin?
I don't know how long ago that we met, but it's been 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I don't remember where or when, but we've been together several times since then, and visited and talked and drove around and stuff. But at first, very first, I was pretty skeptical, because I've had this before, and other people have written other books that I didn't receive them very well. But, and I think it's probably a story that needs to be told because not very many people are familiar with the story at all. And some of the people, when they found out what I was doing, said, well, that's our story and maybe we ought to tell it, but we've had all these years, nearly 100 years, and we haven't told it yet. And I think his version is the best version so far. And I don't think anybody could tell it any better. It's just, I found out a lot of stuff that I didn't know, you know. I
Any
didn't tell him
example in
everything that I knew, I only answered his questions, but and he did an excellent job.
You know, you have an example of something that you didn't know that you found out as a result of his research?
Well, just not right off the top. I'll think of something. Yeah.
I didn't realize that funerals cost $80,000 back in the day. That was something that I learned.
I think one of the shocking things about the book as a whole is the way in which you reveal the systemic corruption at all levels of society, law enforcement, medical elements, the court system, coroner, everybody, it seemed like. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I began the project, I always believe in, when you do research on stories, to be open-minded. I often write about investigators. You can get tunnel vision, you can get locked in, or you could conceive of a story in which you then try to report it out to fit the conception. So when I began researching this story, I thought of it in the kind of traditional way that the FBI had told the story early on and in the early newspaper accounts, which was about William Hale, this kind of singular evil figure who had some henchmen, his nephew, and had committed about more than two dozen murders. And as I did more research, beginning when I spoke to Catherine, and Catherine told me about a suspicious death in her family that wasn't part of the established story. And I began to look into that, and I would speak to other Osage, and I would hear other accounts. Mary Jo Webb, who is here, who spent years investigating a suspicious death in her family. I began to realize that this was much broader. And I made a trip out to I spent a lot of time out in the archives in Fort Worth, Texas, which looks a little like this, but even bigger. And it always reminded me of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they store the records in a vault. And I had pulled these records on the guardianship, which is a story unto itself. And I wanted just to check whether a certain Osage had a guardian. I was just trying to confirm it. So I had pulled these records, and I had pulled this book that was it looked like a ledger. It had a fabric cover, and it basically just listed the guardians, and they referred to them as wards, the Osage Wards, whose finances they had managed during just a few years. And I looked at one of the guardians. I looked at this person had managed 5 Osage's fortunes. The only other thing written in this book was if an Osage had died, somebody had just scribbled the word dead next to it. Some anonymous bureaucrat. And I looked at this one guardian, and there were 5 Osage underneath his name, and beside each name said the word dead. I said, that's kind of crazy. Like, this is just a few years. The Osage had wealth, they had health, they weren't hungry. This was not, and it just defied a natural death rate. And then I began to look at other guardians, and I saw one I think had about a dozen, and there was a 50% mortality rate, and on it went. And then I began to try to look into some of those cases. And I began to realize this was really not a story about who did it. It was much more a story about who didn't do it, and it was about a culture of killing. I think Denny McAuliffe is here, and he's documented a story in his family. Again, not part of the FBI narrative. All these accounts demolished my original conception of the book, and to some extent really took my breath away, because that ledger really contained the hints of a systematic murder campaign.
Mm-hmm. Now, for our Osage guests, this is a very difficult story, and it's a very hard story to tell. And so for someone coming from the outside and writing the story, it's very factual. But for you all, it's a very personal story. And so would you talk a little bit about, as you can or will, about the impact this period in history has had on either your family or the Osage as a whole?
Okay, I'll start. It's had a tremendous impact, and I can't say as the Osage as a whole, but it's, as in our community, our Gray Horse community, it had a big impact because that's where most of it took place. That's where people lived and died, and people had to have lived in fear because they didn't know who was going to be next. They didn't know why it was happening. Well, now we put all this stuff together. We know why through the efforts of law enforcement and that sort of thing. I talked to FBI supervisors last month, and I said what gave them the tools to do this research and do the investigation had its genesis in the 1880s with the Major Crimes Act and the definitions of Indian country throughout the years. And when Henry Roan was killed on a restricted Indian allotment, that was Indian country, that gave the FBI the wherewithal, the reason, the ability to investigate that death. And so there are lots of little players in there, and some of these people I don't even know. I know their name, but I don't know them. And if you crossed Bill Hale, you're liable to get eliminated. And there have been some fictional accounts, and I thought, well, this couldn't be true because no, this man didn't die that way. Somebody else. So, but that was a fictional account. And so I heard about this when I was a little kid. My mom's older sister used to give me little snippets. I don't know why or how that came about, but that was the story. And they lived in that time. They were young people at that time, so they knew all about it. And I knew people who were alive at that time. They told me about my granddad, what a great steer roper was, and what a fine man he was, and he just didn't have any kind of care in me at all. And then he died. And the legend was he came home one evening, laid down on a couch and died. But we find out that it was a lot worse than that.
Catherine?
Well, I was thinking about something that my mother said to me one time. Just kind of out of the clear blue. She said, don't ever put hedges around your house. And I said, oh, well, okay. And I didn't quite get it, and I didn't know why she told me that. But then, in hindsight, when I thought about it, I thought, she had to hide herself. As a child, she was just a young girl when all this was going on. And then I got to thinking about her home out in the country, and it didn't have any hedges at all. And so I asked her later, I said, well, Mom, what did you think about that? What were you thinking about? She said, well, people can hide in those, And I said, yeah, they can. But it didn't make any sense at first, but then, when you get to thinking about it, you think, my gosh, she was just a child. And then she was sent off to boarding school, she and her sisters. And it was a hard time for those kids. And then also for my dad, because his father was poisoned, they think. But of course, there was never an autopsy done to make sure that that's what happened to him.
Margie, anything to contribute?
Oh, when I was a young child, my parents talked about this. And I can remember sometimes, we'd get in the car and we'd drive around and, Mom would say, this happened here, or this is where they blew the house up, and this is where Lily Burkhart built a fence with a concertina wire so nobody could, harm her. And I just remember that there was still some residual fear, it felt like, even when I was small. And then personally affecting me now, I was kind of angry. I was angry because Bill and Ernest took away my Osage family. And I didn't have a family. I had my mother's side, but I didn't have those aunts and uncles and cousins, And yeah, I was really angry about that for a while.
I just was going to say one thing. So when you do history, it can often feel distant or removed. You spend a lot of time in documents, but for me, the most powerful part of doing the research was talking to the people on the stage and other Osage, because you realize this wasn't that long ago. We're talking less than a century, and you realize how this history still reverberates to this day. I remember when Margie took me out to the graveyard in Grey Horse, and you just start looking at the tombs, and you begin to look at the dates and the ages, especially the deaths during this period, and the youth of so many people. You begin to get a real sense of how this history still reverberates today.
Now, this book has traveled far and wide now. A lot of people have been reading it outside of Oklahoma. Are people outside of the state surprised to find out about this story, or how has the reception of it been out in the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think most people, even when I'm in Oklahoma, are like me. They didn't know about this outside of Osage County. There are certainly others who maybe had heard some bits of it, but the breadth of ignorance about this, how much this was missing from our school books, I think that's the comment I hear most often is, why were we not taught this in history? Why did we not learn about this? But I will say I have been surprised. You know, when I worked on this book, I worked on it because I believed in it, and I believed it was an important story. But I was kind of under the assumption that people might not read this kind of story because it points to a part of our history that people don't always want to read.
And that is one of the important parts of reading history that's difficult, is hopefully learning lessons that we don't repeat. Now, the U.S. has a very long history of mistreatment, mismanagement of Native people, yet this story really is resonating with the American public. And why do you think this story is resonating as opposed to a lot of the other things that have happened over the years? Just because they don't know it?
You know what? I don't know if I know the answer. I mean, I think hopefully our society is more ready for this story, or more open to it, more willing to engage with it. I think there are more voices out there now, more perspectives being told upon parts of our history that were once neglected and not told often in other places. At least that's my hope, but I don't know exactly. I mean, I'd be interested in what everyone else thinks about that.
I think the fact that they were the wealthiest people in the world, that got a lot of attention to the reader right off, because people, you know, they always kind of romanticize the American Indian anyway, and then to talk about the wealth that was involved here, and how this could happen to a whole group of people and nobody not even know it in the United States. I mean, that's kind of unbelievable, really.
And I think the story encapsulates so many other stories. I mean, it really encapsulates, for lack of a better word, the original sin from which the country was born, and that original contact. And the other part about it is it was happening very recently.
I was never able to figure out how one guy, a cowhand from Texas, could come up here and do all this. One guy, and influence all these other people from Kansas City to Oklahoma City. How does that happen?
Well, Marvin, would you address why Osage people needed guardians in the first place for our audience who might not know that story?
It's a very interesting question that I can't answer. Because we were deemed to be, and this didn't happen to anybody else, we were deemed not to have the ability to take care of our own affairs. Even when we had guardians, we couldn't take care of our own affairs. They got it. They got it. And so you might have people who they were guardians over several people, you know. And they scraped the top of all the money that came off, they got the top of it.
Any other responses to that? What did you find out, David, that surprised you, just with regards to these guardians being necessary?
It's totally outrageous. I mean, I would say there were many discoveries along the way that shocked me because I didn't know about this history. Anybody here, and you should do it, it's worth it, you should pull congressional testimony from the 1920s where there was an obsession about scapegoating the Osage for their money. I mean, it was the 1920s, the era of the Great Gatsby. You had people like E.W. Marlin blowing his fortune, making it, blowing it, and yet members of Congress would sit around, often with self-righteousness, saying, what are we going to do with these Osage that can't have all this money? And, you know, you could have an Osage chief who led a great nation, and here you had a local white citizen telling them whether they could buy this car or this toothpaste down at the corner store. And it wasn't just an abstractly racist system. It was as Marvin said, I mean, it was a literally racist system. It was based on the quantum of Osage blood. So if you were a full-blooded Osage, you were deemed quote-unquote incompetent and given one of these guardians. And the system wasn't just racist, it also ushered in one of the largest state and federally sanctioned criminal enterprises as these guardians swindled millions and millions and millions of dollars.
I think it's hard for us in contemporary times to realize just how much money was involved. Would the three of you tell any story that you choose to about the way in which life changed for Osage people once this oil wealth came in?
Well, the oil well they started doing oil leases in the 1890s. And then we helped fuel the fires of World War I with Osage oil and the Burbank field, and there was a necessity for it and a need for it. And so the Osage, we got a reservation in 1872. We had the Allotment Act in 1906. And we reserved, in the Allotment Act, they reserved all of the surface area, but maintained the mineral state by the tribe. And the 2,229 members of the Osage tribe, they got 2,229 of a share. Well, that was a pretty big share when you've got all that money coming in, it goes to one person. And so a lot of those folks that had a lot of money, and I used to hear these stories. They had these great big cars. When the ashtrays would get full, they'd get run out of gas, and they would leave it side of the road and go buy another one. Nonsense. My mom said we had a big car, but there were a lot of kids. It's a Pierce Arrow. I saw one at the car show last year, and I was like, wow, nice car. You know, and about how they built houses and lived in the tents in the back. Not true. Not true. But they said that about other people too, you know, so maybe they do all these things, maybe they don't know how to spend their money, you know, how to take care of their money. So we need to give somebody some protection that will protect their interests for them. And what did they do?
Marvin, would you or Margie or Catherine, one thing that's really interesting about the way in which the Osage maintained their mineral rights was in their original treaty-making process. Would you explain that to the people who are here?
That's, we say we're kind of unique, and we are in a way, but a lot of other tribes, they have that as well. But usually when their land was allotted, and that was given to the individual Indian, the title to the property was held in the United States for the benefit of the individual Indian. But they got to keep the mineral rights, the individual. But where the land is held in common, the tribe held it. And I dealt with that up in Utah. But for us, the land was held in common. And then it was divided in the allotment process, but they reserved the mineral rights out of the allotment process and kept it for the tribe. And that's why we got all the money.
Anyone else want to say anything
Well,
about that?
I'd just like to back up just a little bit
Okay.
on guardianships.
Sure.
And when David first contacted me about this, and we had a meeting on it, and of course he was with the New Yorker, and so he was just talking about an article for the New Yorker, and so I thought, oh, this story, there's so much to be told here. But I thought, well, maybe he could do this and, you know, do it in a series and start out with the murders and then get into the guardians, because that's what I really wanted to talk about, was for him to get into that. Because somewhat it still goes on. I mean, there's still guardians there. And I know that my father told me that in Pawhuska, when he was growing up in the 20s, that there were 75 attorneys in Pawhuska. You know, we're talking about a town of 5,000 people. And 75 attorneys there. And, and you still see the remnants of that today. There's still quite a few attorneys in Pawhuska. And, and then with the land, with setting up the reservation like we did, we were the only tribe to do that, to allot the surface, and then we held the other collectively, and then divided it up, like Marvin said, in these 2,229 divisions, which is still active today. But the bad part of that is that you could will it out, as you read in this book, and then that's when the corruption come in.
Marvin, you were going to, I'm sorry, Catherine.
No, my shoulder was bothering
Oh,
me.
I thought you were giving me a signal. All right.
My shoulder's about to fall out of socket. I had to put it back in.
Okay, well, in that case. Margie, do you have anything you'd like to contribute to this part?
No, just the same, pretty much what Catherine said.
Well, let me ask you this, David, because you're writing about Sherlock Holmes, for instance. You have a strong sense of the history of crime fiction, or not crime fiction, but crime reporting, crime writing. Is there a point when you're inside of this book going, oh my gosh, I've really got something here? And how did you balance between not sensationalizing it, but trying to tell this story that's so incredible and horrible at the same time, and yet keep the reader going? Because that's what everybody says that I hear talk about this book. This is a horrible read, but it's a great read at the same time.
So, I guess I'd say two things. One is, I've always been a big believer that you can tell stories in such a way to reach people. And when you write stories, you want to try to reach people who don't necessarily want to read about this kind of thing. And so this story has elements that are of intrigue and conspiracy and, all these elements. But within that, I think you can tell a really important story and get the moral gravity of it. And I thought with a story like this, I really saw it as a work of documentation. And I wanted even the voice and the style while describing these sensational events to be very reserved, because the events need to speak for themselves. I cut out adverbs. I wanted to distill it. I almost wanted it to be just a collection of facts, of documented facts. And it was one of the reasons I did something in this book that I'd never done before, which was to integrate photographs. Because I wanted it to feel like a work of documentation, and also because sometimes the events seem too hard to believe, and then you see the bombing, and you could see the house before the bombing, you could see it after the bombing. So that was kind of my approach. I don't know if I fully succeeded, but that was my hope.
And what do some of our Osage guests hope that will come out of this writing and these events? And this has brought a lot of awareness, not just to this story, but to Osage people as a whole. So what do you hope comes out of this whole process?
Well, I think telling the story is awareness. We're not who you think we might be from stories that you've heard from somebody else, And also, I think that the people that did this, and I've often asked myself, how could they do that? Because they didn't have a heart and they didn't have a soul, and their only ambition was for the money. That's all it was. So how bad can that be? Well, we've seen that it can be pretty bad. It's really hard for me. I know what some of these people look like because I'd seen their pictures, but some of those people, I didn't know what they looked like, still don't know what they look like. Sometimes I wished I could meet them. They were, there's a tribe up along the Canadian border, and they're going through an oil boom. I wish they had come and talked to us, because we could have told them what it was going to be like. And sure enough, it's happening to them as well, except they don't have guardians. They got people that are stealing their money. They got drugs, they got alcohol, they got prostitution, they got the state that's taking all their money from, because, you guys don't need it. They got big oil trucks that are tearing up their roads, but the state is not repairing them. So we've experienced this. And we experienced, you know, my granddad died just a little bit more than 20 years before I was born, you know. And I used to think that was way, that was back in the colonial days when I was hearing about all that stuff, you know. But it wasn't, you know. And I thought, what if my granddad had got to live a while? What if he got to live till he's in his 60s? I had a very good relationship with my mom's dad. He used to take me fishing and camping. He had a cousin who lived over on the Kansas-Missouri border. We used to go over there, you know. Did you ever drive from Wichita to Blue Mountain, Kansas, doing 45 miles an hour in a Jeep wagon, you know? It's tough, let me tell you. But, so what if my dad's dad had lived that long, you know? What could he have told me about being an Osage?
Because some of the people,
About his family, because he was raised by someone who wasn't his father. What could he have told me about his family? Because there's a big disconnect there. There's a big gap there. So my dad grew up an orphan. He died at a young age. So there's a big gap there that we don't know anything about.
and I think that's one of the things that is a theme in the book is loss, obviously, not just material and money, but people and stories and families. So how about you, Margie? What do you think you'd like to see come out of this whole process?
Well, I think that maybe awareness, maybe it will, I don't know, trigger someone to investigate more of Indian history. Maybe, I know people that will read the book to their husband every evening. They read parts of the book, and I'm thinking, well, I hope they'll read it to their grandkids or their kids, and maybe it'll just help them maybe just learn a little bit more about the Indian history and all the tragedies and all the good things that the tribes did, before Europeans came over. Just, make them aware of what tribes are, what tribal citizens are, and how they prospered, and But going back with Marvin said, I don't know why. This is a question about Hale. I mean, the guy was wealthy. How much money did he need? That was always a question that I always asked myself. How much money did he need? Because he was a wealthy man.
And there are houses he built in Fairfax, He built them for people. He was pallbearers at other people's funerals and that sort of stuff. And I told a friend of mine who's 15, 16 years older than I am. I said, I remember when he died. We lived up in Wichita at the time. He said, yeah. I said, there were Osages claimed that he didn't do that he was a really good man, and they attended his funeral. I found that incredulous.
Catherine?
Well, what I would like to see come from this is, there was a land grab going on here too at the same time. And I think that's still going on. And I think it needs to stop. And I think that one of the best things that the Osage Nation has done at this point is purchase one of the biggest ranches. And now starting to buy back land from tribal members where they don't sell it outside of the nation. And I think that's one of the greatest things. And that's what I'd like to see come from this book, that people will know that there's still people out there trying to get what we have, what's left of what we have.
Now, of course, there's a lot of talk about a movie going to come out of this process. So the book has gotten this much attention. How involved will you be in the movie-making process, and what do you think is going to happen there?
So my involvement's pretty limited. I really focus on the books and the history, but it seems to be in hands of people who care about the project. I know they have been speaking to the Osage, to Chief Standing Bear. My hope is, a book can reach so many people, but my hope is that the movie will make this even more part of our national conscious. If people ask me, the one thing I would hope that comes out of the book is that there are less people like me who know nothing about this history.
One of the things we say about Native American history is kind of almost a cliche to say: you get mad, you get sad, you get glad. So you're mad for the way things went down. There's obviously a sad part, but there's sort of a swing up toward the glad part. So would you talk a little bit about some of the good things happening within the Osage Nation today.
Well, the buyback,
Right.
buyback of land, and then the purchase of a big ranch.
Of the Big Turner Ranch.
Because, you know, a lot of people, and I've read it in the newspaper where ranchers have said, well, we need to get our land back. I thought, what are they talking about, get it back? They never had it in the first place, it was ours. And so, you know, I'm all for this, and I hope that from this book that Osages will start to purchase land themselves back in our, because we still, it's not called a reservation anymore, but I still look at it as a reservation. And I have on my return address on my stamp that says, Catherine Redcorn, Osage Reservation. That's Oklahoma. So, that's what I want.
Yeah, there are a lot of good things that we're doing now because of the business interests that we have and that sort of thing. We employ, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, you know. And they all pay, you know, most of them are not Osage. They're not Indians, they're people from other tribes. They all get nice paychecks, and they pay payroll taxes to the state of Oklahoma, you know, and so it's just all going around. And we do our share. People think that we don't do our share, but we do, you know. So I like that part of it, you know. And if you want a job up there, why, you know, and you've got some kind of skill, a lot of times you can get a job if those skills are open, you know. And I like going through the Christmas time. They have a ham turkey giveaway for all the employees, and you line up and you get to a big semi truck, and there's your ham, buddy, you know.
All right. Margie, you're on the Minerals Council. Would you tell us a little bit about what that's like today?
Catherine is.
Oh, Catherine, I'm sorry. On the Minerals Council?
Well, yes, we have a council made up of 8 people, and we're elected by the shareholders. That's what we call them, Osage shareholders, because they're the only ones that can vote in the election. And we handle the oil and gas royalties for the nation.
So all the oil and gas royalties now are controlled by the Osage, within the Osage Nation?
Well, the council is an old council. It was established in 1906. And then when the nation we set up the Osage Nation, then the Minerals Council the Osage Tribal Council become the Minerals Council, but it's still a part of the nation.
I see. All right, well, we're getting to the end of our presentation here. David, what have you not said about this book that you would like to tell the people who are here tonight?
Well, I guess 2 things. One, just referring to your last question. You know, one of the reasons in the book I have the section in the present was to try to broaden out the story and show these other cases, but was also to show how vibrant the Osage Nation is today. And I always think of this quote from this attorney, an Osage attorney who I spoke with, and I'm paraphrasing, but she said something like, we were victims of these crimes, but we don't live as victims. And I think that's always really important to underscore that history did not stop. And I really look at history as kind of a living organism. And even since this book has come out, I have had more information come to me. I've had other families reach out to me. Margie, we had somebody reach out to me who was the son of the man who Molly married after Ernest, and I know that she has now spoken to Margie. History is still kind of percolating, and I hope that this just kind of continues to grow. I mean, I think that would be, you know, I see this as the beginning and not the end of the story.
So that's one thing that you didn't say. What's the other thing? You said 2 things.
Oh, 2 things. Well, this is a part of that, the flip side of that, which is, for me, one of the hardest things that I often felt a bit futile and helpless about was, so for example, Catherine had mentioned at some point after we got to know each other better, she told me the story about a suspicious death in her family. And she had given me a little bit of trails of evidence, and I tried to look into it. And because so many of the witnesses were dead, and because so many of the suspects are now dead, And because the conspirators in so many of these cases covered up the crimes, that in many of these cases, you're not able to fully bring that resolution. For me, that was one of the hardest parts about this, was knowing that there were these other cases. I had always thought of, when I began this project, that history, I've written about injustices in other situations, and I always thought of history as a way to provide an accounting in which you record voices of the victims and you identify the perpetrators. But that was not always possible. And the perpetrators in these cases, in many cases, they did not only erase the lives of the victims, they also erased their history. And it's a secondary crime, but a no less nefarious crime. But I do hope that over time, that at least we'll get at least a few more clues and bits of evidence, because I know a lot of people, people like Mary Jo Webb over here, who've had to live with this and investigated it, where there isn't this, you didn't have these cases resolved properly and adjudicated, and the criminals prosecuted.
Now, if not necessarily a criticism, but we all have access to social media, and one of the voices that kind of came up through this book process was, here's David Grann coming from New York, he's exploiting this story, and he's just another non-Osage who's reaping the benefits of this story for his own purposes. Now, how do you respond to that?
Well, I hope not. You know, when I began this project, I did not envision it would, to be honest, it would have success. I began it because I thought it was a really important story. And I spent about 5 years on it, and during those 5 years, there was more struggle than reward. And I hope the Osage who I've met know that I want to give back. I feel very committed to that. I feel committed to the relationships I formed. I'm not good at many things. I'm a terrible athlete. I dreamed of becoming a basketball player, and I think this will be the closest I ever come. I don't have many talents. I'm semi-blind. I'm awkward. But I care passionately about the things I write about and try to document. And so the one thing I hope that people will feel when they read the book, and more than anyone, I hope the Osage feel that way, that I at least try my best to do this story justice, and to hopefully give back partly by making it part of not just my consciousness, but a broader consciousness in this country, that we begin to reckon with this history.
Good answer. We have just a few minutes left. Is there anything that you'd like to say as a kind of a final statement?
I would like to say something
Please.
about something that Marvin was talking about. He'd like to have met these people. And it so happened that the woman that my grandfather was married to was still alive when we was doing some of these checks, and I found her. And so I had made all my arrangements to go meet her and go see her. And divine intervention stepped in, and she died before I could get there. But it was going to happen really quick. And I just assumed that from that, we were not supposed to meet these people.
Interesting. Margie?
You know, I appreciated the book. I really did. I thought it was well written. And when I was in high school, I had a history teacher, and he said, you know, you ought to write a story. You ought to write a book about this. And I can't, those comments that the Osage should have wrote this book, you know, there was plenty of opportunity for someone to write that book, but no one did. And so I can't imagine why they would say something, you know. So I didn't. I was too lazy,
Right.
so, you know.
And can I just add one last thing? I don't think my book is, like I said, history is living. I think you learn more through more perspectives. And I hope there are more accounts. I hope more people tell the story and tell their portion of the story. Cases aren't closed, and history is not definitive. It is it is a evolving learning process. And so I've told what I could tell, but I know others will tell more, and that's a great thing. You want to build, you want to learn more, you want to construct. And there were great books before this, too.
Marvin?
People say we should have wrote our story ourselves, but nobody can write as well as he can. You know? But there are so many people involved, you know, and he pulled all of those people together, you know, and made a whole story out of it, you know. And that's what gets me is I just don't know how one guy could do all of that, how he'd have so much control, but he did. And, you know, he was the Al Capone of Fairfax, you know. And a friend of mine, a guy I went to high school with, I've been in high school for a long time, and he wrote me an email the other day, and he said, well, Steve read the book, and he gave me the book to read, and he said, spoiler alert, he told me that you were in it. And I said, okay, you know, and I thought, and he said, but we didn't know about this. Oh, but we did, because when we were in high school, there's a book come out called The FBI Story. And there was a chapter about that in that, which was made into a movie. But in the movie, they called Fairfax Ute City. But, you know, that's what that was about, you know. And once in a while, you'll see it on late night TV or something, you know. But I'm going to remind him of that when I answer his email.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our presentation here tonight, so how about a hand for our presenters? Awesome. Thank you very much, and I would be remiss if I did not ask for a hand for the people of the Stillwater Public Library, Linda Reynolds and her staff. They've put together a wonderful 2 months of Osage presentations. The Stillwater Public Library, just all free programming. It's just been really wonderful. And of course, we appreciate all of you who came out tonight to be with us. We want to remind you that Mr. Grann will be signing books in the lobby after we finish here. We hope you all have safe trips back to your homes, and we wish you a good night.